The quest for knowledge launched the human race. We mapped the oceans, charted the stars, weighed the atom. We built giant machines to measure tiny quarks, and tiny machines that measure vast cosmic echoes. With every observation, we crossed horizon after horizon until we reached the internet. A new frontier full of promise and opportunity. But in our haste, we downed our tools and jumped in feet first, spawning an ecosystem of bugs, worms, and 404 errors, browsers with blind spots, and platforms raised on shaky ground. We can't improve what we don't measure, so we're taking up tools of a new kind, ensuring that every piece of code can do its best work, establishing the standards by which software runs, so that what we build will do exactly what we want. Instrumenting, measuring, improving, together in pursuit of a more perfect internet.
Hello everyone, and welcome to our latest installment of Devon Bites. Today I'm going to be giving a talk on New Relic and how we use it for SRE and how you can kind of participate in that process. To everyone who's joining us from YouTube, thank you. As long as you're signed into your Nextiva account, you can comment in the channel, and Eric will relay your comments to me, and I'll answer any questions. If for some reason you can't comment, just Slack Eric, and he will relay those questions to me. You'll hear me repeat them out loud. That's for the benefit of everyone on YouTube and maybe people who couldn't hear Eric. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Aaron. For those of you who do know me, I'm very sorry. All right, let's get started. All right, so SRE, like anything else in Agile, is an iterative process. And we're going to go over a little bit of that iterative process and how it works. We're also going to cover understanding risk and risk preparedness, and then we're going to go to the New Relic section to explore our available tooling options. So iteration, as we all know, is a small Dutch handbasket used to carry picnic supplies. But since this is really only a surface level topic, we're going to refer to it as a small Dutch handbasket. Okay, now that we've got the jokes out of the way. So SRE typically starts with a problem. During a major outage, a company, all these questions come up: root cause, mitigating factors. People want to know what happened and why. A major disaster is typically a turning point for any company to start exploring the SRE process. And in that iteration, the first step is normally monitoring. We don't typically know what happened, and we want to make sure that it doesn't happen again, so we set up our monitoring. And our results are typically less than satisfactory with only monitoring. So now our barn burned down, and we woke up the next day, looked at our monitoring tools, and confirmed, yes, the barn was on fire, and it did burn down. So while we have our metrics and our tracking in place, they're not really helping us if we don't take action on them. And so to take action on them, we normally set up alerting. And alerting results are typically also not super great. The only problem that we have with alerting and monitoring together is that if you don't know what actions to take on those alerts, you can't respond fast enough to put out that fire before it takes the whole barn down. And so this is when a lot of companies decide that they need a team that's going to respond to these alerts. And that's where SRE team comes from. And the SRE team, as you can see, gets there just in time to put out the smoldering ashes of the barn. And this is like a little bit of a joke, but also one of the things that can be really difficult for SRE is understanding the width of our products. There's so many different applications and services that we don't always know what the correct action to take is. So a lot of times you'll see that when we don't know what to do, we'll escalate back to devs. That's a very reactive approach, and that's sort of where this talk of like risk analysis and preparedness comes in. So understanding risks is about knowing what risks your software has. So in software, our primary risks are going to be our third-party integrations, our internal dependencies, so like service-to-service communication or application-to-service communication. Our external dependencies, that's going to be like Intrado, Vantiv, anything that we're calling outside of our own network to hit, and vulnerabilities. That could be like software vulnerabilities to a hack. I'm not sure how many of you remember when we had NextOS portal go down after someone was able to remotely delete everything in the Tomcat folder. But that's an example of a risk that can actually happen live in production and did happen live in production. So risk mitigation, once we understand what our dependencies are, we can start designing our application with failure in mind. So a lot of that comes in with resolving how you're going to handle the failures of your dependencies. And you can't always do that, right? We're a fast-moving company. We put products out to market at a fast pace. And so sometimes we can't always resolve things in development. And so what that comes down to is having action plans for those risks that we can't resolve in development, whether it be database failovers. Before we can automate those processes, we still have to be prepared to handle them. And part of documenting that process, the important parts are making sure that they're trainable processes and that we know what our time to resolve is on that. That's how we can build an effective SRE team. And so this is actually a risk matrix. This is what a risk assessment would look like. And so what you would do is you would grade your risks on the probability and the severity. And in order to put yourself in a comfortable situation, you'd want to address a lot of those high-level risks and those serious-level risks. Maybe a lot of the mediums can be set off for later after you've already addressed your more high-impacting or more frequent risks. And the lows can probably be delegated just to runbooks, if even. And then eliminated, obviously as you address those high and frequent errors, you would move them down to the eliminated column. And the more of those red squares you move down to eliminated, obviously the better everyone feels sleeping. So New Relic is one of the tools that we can use to start identifying our dependencies. It can be kind of difficult in an environment that has so many different applications to understand. When you may know that you talk to authentication service, but do you know that authentication service is talking to ForgeRock? And so you might not know what all of your dependencies are. And so New Relic has a few tools. It's got service maps and distributed tracing that can sort of help you identify what your critical path is. And it's really important to remember that all of the dependencies of your dependencies are your dependencies. That is to say, if ForgeRock, for instance, has a 97% uptime, and authentication service, which I know that it doesn't, so don't feel like I'm picking on you guys, but if authentication service sends every request through ForgeRock, then authentication service has a 97% uptime. Anything that is relying then on authentication service for every request has a 97% uptime. So whatever your weakest dependency is, that is your highest available uptime. Another thing that we can look at is transaction monitoring and key transactions. And this can really help the SRE team understand when situations that may look fine are not. And I'll go into a little bit more how that works and why key transactions can help us. But first, let's look at New Relic and see some of these tools. So I'm going to go a little bit into transactions, even though this is really the critical path one, but that's kind of to show you the difference between the transactions and distributed tracing and sort of the benefits that you get with distributed tracing. So once we sign in, we get to the APM, which is sort of the landing page. And so we can see all of our different applications. We'll go into NextOS portal first. Well, it'll be the only one that we go into, but for here. So this is our main dashboard. You can see that the transactions are down in the bottom left corner. And there's also another transactions on the sidebar menu. And once we open up our transactions, we get sort of a pattern of all of our transactions by the most time consuming. And so we can click into any of these individual transactions and we'll get a little bit more detail on them. So we can see where those calls are taking the most time inside of that, API call. And we can open up any one of those individual ones to check out, like, this is kind of a partial trace. So this is what our regular transaction traces look like without distributed tracing. So from here we can see that there's 2,982 calls to services.nextiva.com, and we don't really get a lot of a picture of where a lot of that occurs, other than somewhere between here at 6 seconds and then 155 seconds. So we can see that there's 2,979 calls to services.nextiva.com, but we don't really get a big breakdown. And this is me messing around on a video. So once we go into our distributed traces, on the other hand, we get a little bit more granularity. We can sort by a few different factors. So we could sort by trace duration. We could sort by dependent services, the total amount of spans and methods, our errors that were involved in that individual trace. So let's open up one based on time duration and take a look. There we go. And so you can see that that call that we before just saw as services.nextiva.com is now identified as voice service calls. And this in-process span is going to give us the unique ability to sort of follow that method trace all the way down. So we can see exactly how much time was spent in each part of that method. So we can see there was a call out to the database, but it only took 1 millisecond. It's not really a huge deal. And all of these individual calls to services.nextiva.com took a really short amount of time. But as we saw before, there's 2,900 of them. So it's not necessarily that for this call that there was any one thing where it spent a lot of time doing. We can tell that it was just the number of calls that resulted in that request being so large. And we can also see that it's actually an outlier on this graph. So it's clearly something that doesn't happen very often. It might be something that we want to prevent from happening. And so now if we look at service maps, sorry, that's a little bug in New Relic. But if you go in from the main overview page and you look at service maps, how many of you think that you know all the dependencies of NextOS portal? We know account service, we know E91, we know voice service. We're going to let New Relic actually discover the environment for NextOS. And you might be surprised at some of the dependencies that are listed here. So when you highlight over that individual app, all of those arrows that become highlighted are things that are being directly called by NextOS portal. So even though we have the voice service, we can see that NextOS directly calls all of the cpadmin portals. So even though we have the voice service that's supposed to be mitigating that, NextOS still has a dependency directly and indirectly on the cpadmin. We also see some calls to Intrado for address checking. And even though it has the E911 service where all those calls are supposed to go through, it is still hitting Intrado directly. In that IP address there, the 192.168.199.70, that's analytics. And so there's a few dependencies outside of what you might just think of off the top of your head. One thing that you might notice about this is that the voice service and the account service are missing. New Relic is good at figuring out what the dependencies are, but it's not great. So sometimes you should just verify, and if you go to that app service list, you can add them individually, and it is really good at connecting everything once you've done that. So now we'll take a look at our second video. And this is going to be about transaction monitoring. There. Okay, so key transactions, probably something that you've seen up on this little top menu. If you go into here, you'll notice it's not very filled out. But what we do get out of this is that that is actually the response time and call count and error percentage for just that call in the portal. We can set an individual app dex and a browser response time for any of these requests. And those are independent of the actual APM app dexes. And so if we go into, this time I picked the CRM API. We can go back down to that transactions list, and we can see the average app server time spent on some requests. So this is sorted by time consuming again, and we can pick really any of these, but I believe what I go down here and do is show you the transactions table. So the transaction table is super neat. It actually gives you those same stats that we saw in the key transactions for any one of your API calls. And so you can sort by any of these metrics: dissatisfied percentage, count, average response time, what your app dex is, and as well as like your max response time if you're looking for outliers. This is a great place to go if you are looking for where your app is slowing down. And so looking at this API resource v3 get, in particular I chose this one because that 49.7 is how much total time the application spends on these calls. So this is a super important call. This is what the application spends almost half of its time doing. And we can actually compare the historical performance of how it did last week with the past couple days. And so we can see that there were some spikes last week that don't appear this week, so maybe we're doing something right and we get a bit of improved performance out of it. And then right at the top of that, you can click track as a key transaction. You can rename it if you want to. I didn't here. And then we can view it. And this is what our key transaction map looks like. So we can see it basically gets its own dashboard at this point. We can pick out an SLA report for it. We can look at the app dex score. We can see its individual throughput of just that request without all the APM noise in it. And it helps us sort of dial in on just this transaction. And most importantly, we can actually set alerts for just this transaction. So going into our CRM API policy, if we go into an add alert or add alert condition, you'll see some of these options here. So if we go to APM, we have key transaction metric. And we can select the key transaction that we just added and define our alert thresholds. And alert thresholds can be really on any of the things that it tracks for metrics, whether it be app dex or components of those app dex. So we have our throughput, we have our response time, or our app dex, which is a component of both. And so I chose 0.7 because app dex as a formula, you set what your tolerable response time is. So this is really saying when 70% of our, or when our requests are below 70% of our tolerated response time, we consider those requests slow or frustrating to our customers. And so that's where we set our alert. And so now also the warning threshold you can add, and a run book as well. So the run book is what we'll get into after we cover these videos. But for right now, we're just going to look at sort of how that graph looks. You can see that it adds a little yellow dotted line. That's our warning threshold. And the red dotted line is our alert threshold. New Relic will let you know if an app is in warning, but normally will not take action. Whereas alert, it will send out an Ops Genie alert. SRE team will get the go on it, and we will start investigating. And so one of the things that picking these key transactions for your applications go, like I chose the API v3 off of the fact that I saw that the app was spending 50% of its time there. That might not necessarily make it a key transaction. You can have something that is actually very quick and still have it be a key component. we're not always going to know what the key methods are that your app uses as part of its function. So what would be really helpful is if we could start identifying those by going through the New Relic profiles for our apps and doing sort of what I just did right here, which is going in, looking at your transactions, finding the key ones, finding ones that you might want to alert on, and later on adding a run book and letting us know how you want us to act when those alert thresholds are exceeded. And the one thing that I did want to touch on really quick is that you'll notice that this map is not filled out. That is because it is part of an older New Relic feature that is cross-application tracing, and it has been completely replaced by distributed tracing. So this is not an error, this isn't missing. This is just the result of us adding distributed tracing. So to sort of just reiterate over what we kind of covered there, you can use distributed tracing to track down the inefficiencies in your transactions and follow them all the way through to all your dependencies. Service maps can group your dependencies in sort of a logical flow and help you identify your application environment. Transactions tell us what our app or service spends the most time doing and how well it does it. And our key transactions can be individually monitored, reported, and alerted on. So what we have right now, the SRE team is mostly what I would call a reactive team. We're in a very reactive state. So we have a collection of action plans for various incidents that we have tried to proactively identify, but that is based on the knowledge that we have together as a team and not really as a department. We have a bunch of runbooks that have been created on demand. So as alerts have popped up and we've resolved them, we've added runbooks for ourselves to help each other out in solving problems, depending on who's on call. But there's more of an event issue focus instead of an application focus. So instead of understanding what could go wrong with the app, they're more focused on what has gone wrong with the app. And if you want to check out our SRE runbooks, are we sending out a copy of the presentation to? I mean, I can put it on Confluence. But we have, in the SRE space in Confluence, a grouping of runbooks for, the problems that we've faced so far or problems that we predicted might occur in the future. As far as the New Relic monitoring and alerting goes, we have generalized alerts and app dexes set for across the board. And as those have come through, we've tried to tune and tweak them specifically towards different functionality expectations out of the different apps, but they're not perfect. And they can only get more perfect by having everyone sort of come together to decide what is our performance level. So the first steps I would say for us as a department would be to sort of get a better understanding of what our risks are. So a lot of that is going to come down to using those service maps, using that distributed tracing to try and start formulating that risk matrix. Try and start deciding what your frequent errors are going to be or what a catastrophic error is for you, and understand whether or not we're currently equipped and prepared to deal with that. Yeah.
So you talked about starting with risk assessment. Is that something SRE helps teams do?
I'm sorry, one more time?
You said we should start with risk assessments or planning for failure. Is that something the SRE team does and helps other teams do?
So the question was, is risk management and risk matrices something that the SRE team helps other teams do, and is that part of what we do? The answer is absolutely yes. We've actually come together, we had a what could go wrong workshop last week amongst ourselves to try and start planning for both the CRM prod and CRM demo environment, what it was that could go wrong, what the probability and severity of our risks were, and anyone on our team would be over the moon to sit with any of our dev teams and help you formulate that. We would love to. Oh. Thanks for tuning in, everyone on YouTube. Everyone have a wonderful weekend.
Hi, I'm Kyle, the producer of Devon Bites, along with the other EX team members. Hey, we are so excited to watch Devon Bites been growing and getting better and better with each episode. We want to encourage you, if you have a great idea and would like to present on Devon Bites, email exteam@nextiva.com. We'd love to hear your ideas and get you scheduled. We'll work together to make sure you have a flawless presentation. Thank you. Okay, we recording?
Yes.
Okay. Hi, I'm Kyle, the producer of Hi, I'm Kyle. Don't laugh.
God, the joys of recording.
And we have been so hold on, back up. Hi, I'm Kyle, the producer of Devon Bites, along with the other EX team members. EX team members. One more time.